Hey everybody! Welcome to Friday the 13th, the series. I'm your producer, Robert.
And I'm your guest, Jeremiah.
And after a complete, spoiler-filled recap of the episode, we are going to discuss the show you either just learned existed or always wondered how it existed. We promise the answers will be few and far between because we're just here to have some goofity fun exploring a show that, despite or possibly even because of its faults, isn't good and isn't so bad it's good, but is still somehow oddly charming. Let's dive in, shall we? Thank you for joining us for what I consider the Kill Bill Volume 2 of this podcast review of Episode 13. The typical insanity of a Friday the 13th the series premise came at us fast and furious in Part 1. Now we're slowing it down to cover a myriad subjects in depth. From the evolution of color film stock to the filmography of Tim Burton to the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Count Dracula. And no, I don't mean Vlad the Impaler. We'll also share a few film recommendations with you in our proprietary segment, Curio of the Week. My returning guest, Jeremiah, is an aficionado and has seen the whole series, whereas I'm discovering the show episode by episode. Whichever category you fall into, you can presently find the complete, unabridged run of Friday the 13th the series on YouTube for free. And just to take all the guesswork out of it, we've provided a link on the Inner Demon Entertainment website. Just head on over to our podcast page. Just to recap quickly, Ryan the Lion rushed in, figuratively double-tapped the vampiress. And actually, before I go on, I just have to point out, this moment reminds me a bit of the animated episode of The Tick, in which we learn that Sewer Urchin, in his own kingdom, is actually kind of a badass.
That's a good reference. I've not thought about that in quite some time. That's great. There is a world where Ryan is the great conqueror of all demonic things and all great evils of the world.
It's happening between all the episodes we're seeing.
Right. There will be statues of him in the future, folks. Just you wait.
And there are sexy final freezes of him that we're just not getting.
Right. Too true.
This is where we get our first instance of slow motion. And I want to talk about this because this episode is already doing a lot stylistically, so I kind of thought it was a bridge too far. It was used both here for dramatic effect and then later to create, I suspect, sort of a dream sequence type feeling, even though whether or not what we're seeing is a dream is debatable. I think it might have been overused just a little bit, but it's kind of interesting that it's never from the vampire's point of view. It's not like the vampire is moving so quickly he's entered bullet time. It's more objective than that every time it's used.
Basically, it's a slow motion grab and then slow motion disappear, right?
Yes. Jagger has grabbed Mickey. They both looked into each other's eyes, had a cosmic moment, but that's not what cues the slow-mo. We cut to Ryan still on the ground with the dead vampiress. He starts to get up and then just begins running in slow motion.
He's trying to get there in the nick of time. The drama of the slow motion makes sense.
But then Mickey and Jagger almost seem like they've simply frozen and become statues. And it's just weird to see slow motion with two actors completely still and then the third actor moving quickly. But then when Jack gets up, still yelling about the cape, he's moving in real time. And then we see the blood drip, probably in slow motion. Ryan then jostles them in slow motion. Then Ryan speaks.
In real time.
Despite the fact he's moving slowly.
Yeah.
So the cutting back and forth between the slow motion coupled with him speaking normally despite moving slowly, all very jarring.
If you weren't watching these things for the sake of review, is it any more outlandish than when in Avengers Endgame, Captain America and Thanos are separated by this giant wasteland that was the Avengers headquarters, but they're talking in a normal volume as if they can hear each other?
I probably would have noticed if they spoke softly sometimes and heard each other fine, but then other characters entered the scene and were yelling at each other from the exact same distance.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, I don't think we really even needed the exposition that is said here. I think you could have just had Jack Marshak rise up into frame slowly, not say anything, have Ryan rush in, try to grab them, and just have everything play out in slow motion with the visuals and the music.
I mean, I guess my only counter comment on that would be that just the nature of TV, especially back then, because now we have more what we call attention television. But a common philosophy behind television production is you always want to make it to where an audience can kind of follow it, even if they're flipping through a magazine.
Yeah, this was that BBC thing of we make television for people who are going to get up in the middle of the show and go into the kitchen to make a pot of tea.
Right. Yeah, to have a long pivotal sequence where something weird is about to happen. It's already confusing to where if you're not paying any attention whatsoever, and to have all that happen in silence with no dialogue would probably be a note that a TV producer would say, yeah, don't do that. And that's always the thing. Like, every medium has their own little quirks. The medium of comic books, people always make jokes about how many words are exchanged while like someone is leaping in the air.
While Spider-Man is punching the lizard.
There's 3 balloons from 2 different characters, one directly responding to the previous balloon, all happening in that literal fraction of a second. Mediums also evolve over time, but you still have that. That's still a format of TV versus programming for movies and things like that.
I'm definitely not comparing this to modern day television. No, I'm sorry. I am definitely comparing this to modern day television. I'm not comparing it to television of its day.
Right. No, it's a good note though, because yeah, that is something that stands out and is quirky as a component of the medium.
We're definitely going to see slow motion later in the episode, so we can discuss it more when we get there.
Well, I'm curious though, on this one specific example though, what would make it flow better or make it less odd?
I mean, if I was really doing this, I would have to think long and hard about this, but probably using the footage we already have to the best of my ability. When Jack Marshak sits up and is staring very intently, maybe going into slow motion there, seeing the blood drip on the clasp in slow motion, Ryan rushing in slow motion, and then they disappear.
Okay, yep.
Spitballing that off the top of my head. If I had more time to think about it, maybe I'd do something else, but
sure.
I think actually you could use only the footage they have and even cut out the part where Ryan initially starts his run toward the camera in slow motion and simply cut to the 3 shot of them with Ryan running in slow motion.
Yep.
For a split second there, I thought maybe I would have to add a shot or two, a little more coverage to make my thought work. But no, actually, I think you could do it entirely with what we have here, and it might actually be a hair shorter and tighter.
Right.
I think my cut would, I'm not going to say clarify, because I'm not sure I know what's actually happening here or throughout the episode, but it would at least pick a path the way that we've decided things must happen with these items in this story and this reality.
Right. I do think you'd still get the note, as I said, though, that they'd want those ADR lines back in.
I agree.
Product of its time.
Aren't we all?
Yeah.
Well, Ryan joins them, and even though his blood has not hit the clasp, it's enough to pull him into its event horizon, and his sheer proximity sucks him with them through time and space, and they disappear from the scene in a pretty basic fade out.
So we jump through time.
Yes, we hard cut to black and white footage in London.
So it's Wizard of Oz inversed.
Good point.
At the end of the day, the primary reason why this episode is a little bit more highly recognized as a top-rated episode or what have you is exactly for this reason that we're about to go into.
Absolutely. This is the big show. This is what you're all here for. This is the black and white episode, folks. And this is the reason why you, Jeremiah, wanted to talk about this episode.
Yeah, there's a lot to really go into here just on this black and white issue. And part of it is sort of what that really meant, especially on TV at that time. So to paint that context, you did not have black and white stuff on TV in the 80s. Hardly ever.
In the late 80s.
This was a bold and risky move from most people's perspectives. I think like a year or two prior to this, Moonlighting had done a fantasy episode in which it was basically done as a film noir, one-off dream sequence type episode.
Really? Well, I'm sure our fans are interested in Moonlighting, so let me ask, did they also do other high-concept episodes like a musical number?
Oh, yes. Moonlighting was actually very known for doing a lot of random things. It was a very mixed show. Some were played fairly straightforward, the detective story of the week, with the 2 leads going out there and doing things. But it was a show that would break the third wall quite a bit. They would break into a musical number. Bruce Willis's character would make a comment about how the network's not going to like this one, every now and then.
Bruce Willis on Moonlighting was the Deadpool of his day.
There are episodes where they would literally pull out, look at the crew, and, point to the fact that they're there, look at the audience. And then there's episodes where they wouldn't do it at all. They just play it straight. That was like part of its unique charm in a way, which was almost more weird to me, but felt like it happened more and more as the show progressed.
Well, folks, this is why I do this show. I had no idea.
That show was at the time, one of the more acclaimed shows on television. But that particular black and white episode was one that was, for that season, in the top couple episodes in terms of critical appeal.
It was the Community of its day.
Yeah, well, and it was a big hit.
Oh, I know. That's why I'm surprised I didn't know that about it, even though I never actually watched it. But it would be on TV in rooms that I was in, and I always thought it was a pretty straightforward detective-type show.
Yeah, but I can't even say for a fact that Moonlighting was the first one to do it. But either way, it was very rare.
Let me just play devil's advocate for 1 second, though. But audiences at that time would still see shows in syndication from the black and white era. Twilight Zone, early episodes of Gilligan's Island, things like that, right?
So yes, if you were watching in syndication Leave It to Beaver, Andy Griffith, Twilight Zone, and all these classic shows, they would be in black and white. That said, as a culture in that period, black and white was far from beloved. It was quite the opposite.
It was the disco of the 80s?
It was. There'd been black and white films that continued to be made long after color films had become popularized.
Psycho, for example.
Yeah, Psychos. But I mean, really, throughout the 50s, it was roughly half and half. And through the 40s, it was mostly black and white, even though color had been well established in the 30s. A lot of people look at color and think that The Wizard of Oz was the first one. No. I mean, there'd been different color attempts going all the way back to Thomas Edison. But even Technicolor, which is what you had in The Wizard of Oz, even that had been around since late 20s, early 30s. There were some famous Disney shorts in the 30s that were in color. Snow White was in color. And there were actually multiple companies developing color film throughout the 1910s.
Wasn't there even a primitive color gradation process where they could take black and white films and, in a very crude way, colorize them?
There was a dyeing process. There was also, and this is what Thomas Edison, I think, was doing, was literally going frame by frame and coloring things in, which certain productions did. There was Kinemacolor, I think is what it was called, which actually, for these Friday the 13th listeners out there, you might find this interesting. The guy who developed that was a guy named George Albert Smith. And he's important in the film world for A, developing a color technique, and B, for developing certain editing techniques. But he's actually more famous as being 1800s famous hypnotist and psychic.
Okay.
Who actually published these academic works that were really implying that there were actual psychics and hypnotists, and then later was part of a whole debunking scandal around that. But anyway, he was a pioneer of color film, a 2-color process that they did that would actually not be something you'd have to do in hand and not something you'd need extra projecting to do. And that was the precursor then for Technicolor, which I think a lot of people have at least heard of.
Well, I should hope.
Technicolor had been working on color techniques. Couldn't tell you the exact year, but I want to say it was like maybe 1915, 17, 20, somewhere in there.
Folks at home, you can probably put money on those dates. He's just being modest.
Well,
he knows exactly what year it was.
Well, I do know that they started with a 2-color process and then switched over to like a 3-color process. I want to say they hit the 3-color process in the late 20s, early 30s, because by 1932, 33, that's when Walt Disney's Flower and Trees animated short was coming out and using that process. And then a year later or 2 years later, they did The Cat and the Fiddle, which was live action.
Oh, I really hope this episode finds the one guy in the world who knows you're off by like 6 months and is just fuming and just writes the most excoriating comments.
Exactly. So, yeah, you'll have to, definitely double check these dates, folks, because I'm not standing by them 100%.
Dear idiots.
Yeah. But you get to the 50s and TV's coming along, and TV is almost exclusively in black and white. 1950 or 1951, CBS did their big first commercial sponsored color program that was like a variety show. But it was few and far between, mostly because most households didn't have color TVs. But it wasn't until like 1963, it was NBC came out with a big announcement that we're going to start the next year basically moving all to color. And then as soon as they announced it, 64, ABC followed suit.
Got to keep up with the Joneses.
Yep, got to keep up with the Joneses. By 65, everybody in the U.S. was following that suit. And in 65, there was a huge increase in the number of color TVs in American homes.
Wow, in just a 2-year span.
Right. Still black and white TVs. I mean, even I as a kid, we had 2 TVs when I was young, and one of them was black and white still.
There's a whole episode of The Wonder Years largely dedicated to that premise.
Yeah, where they want one for Christmas. Absolutely, yeah. And along those lines, as I said, starting in 63 with NBC, every TV network is really pushing color TV. It's the hot thing. It's the new thing. They mention it in every ad spot for a new show premiering. It's in color, even though by that point, all the shows are starting to be available in color. Likewise, the movies, who had been moving fastly towards color because initially in the 50s, that was a way that they could distinguish themselves from TV as being, well, we're better than TV because very little on TV is in color, but we have most things in color. So as soon as TV says, hey, folks, we're doing everything in color now, movies are like, well, we need to start doing everything in color too. From that point on, everyone is being told black and white, it's lame, it's old, it's dated. Color is the thing you want to be. Color is what you want in your TV. Color is what you want in your films. And that push really made it so that those generations of Gen X and the later half of the baby boomers, which oddly enough is called Generation Jones, as in Keeping Up with the Joneses.
Oh, funny bit of synchronicity. Serendipity.
That's where that comes from.
I knew it was an old-timey phrase from before my time, but I didn't know specifically where it came from.
Yeah, I don't know exactly when the year it was first used, but it was the 1950s. I think it was a television presenter that first popularized it or said it. And then around like 1955-ish, it became a common phrase and I think a book title or magazine articles would have that as the title of the article.
Wow. Well, that was insanely apt and fortuitous that I should use it with reference to our discussion.
Yeah. They'd all been taught and made to think and trained that black and white's lame. Color is the way to go. So much so to where, if you remember back in the 80s, they were going back and colorizing old films.
Thanks a lot, Ted Turner.
Ted Turner and Hal Roach, all these different big media, TV, film institutions were pushing black and white is so lame. Let's colorize it and make it cool again. And of course, just to clarify, I mean, there's always that individual that doesn't follow the trends and doesn't agree and likes big band music, even though rock and roll is well established.
Damn you, Brian Setzer.
Yeah, I enjoyed black and white films, even during the 80s.
I enjoyed them just fine. I was a big fan, even as a kid, of The Honeymooners and The Twilight Zone. I didn't have any problem with the fact that one day I would see an episode of Gilligan's Island in black and white, and the next day color, and the next day black and white, and the next day color. But all that said, now that you mention it, I do remember thinking it was very weird when I saw the trailer for Ed Wood.
Yep.
I thought to myself, a black and white movie. That is a strange choice.
It illustrates the point even more. So that's 94 is when Ed Wood came out. Tim Burton, who was the hot thing in movies, huge success with Batman, huge success with Beetlejuice, and Edward Scissorhands wasn't necessarily a giant box office, but very respectable.
Oh, and Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Wasn't that a big hit?
I don't know that it was a big, giant box office hit, but it's certainly a well-liked film. But Batman changed the culture in a way.
Yes, that was huge.
So the point is everyone in Hollywood wants to work with Tim Burton. Every studio wants to work with Tim Burton. And he was pretty embedded with Warner Brothers. They wanted to keep him happy. And despite the fact that we want to keep this kid happy, so he keeps working with our studio, when he came to them and said, I want to make this film called Ed Wood, they're like, oh, great, fantastic, Tim. Anything you want to make. He says, I want to do it in black and white. They're like, oh, okay, we pass.
Whoopsie doodle do, my friend.
They're like, we can't make money on a black and white feature. As quirky as your film sounds already, we would do it if you could just agree to not do it in black and white. Tim says, nope, I want to do it in black and white. So Disney also says, you know what? We don't expect much return on this film if you're going to do it in black and white. But they decide, let's think long term. We'll pay for this black and white movie and build that relationship and lead you away from Warner Brothers. And then your next several films, where you'll probably go back to doing them in color, maybe you'll come to us to do those films instead.
Speaking of Friday the 13th, the series, now we own your soul.
Right. Yeah, Disney is just full of cursed objects. That is what's really in the Disney Vault. It's not old animated films they're not going to show you for 10 years. It's actually nothing but cursed objects.
I absolutely want to get back to the cultural zeitgeist, but I have to ask before we leave the subject, But didn't Tim Burton make Frankenweenie before any of that other stuff, and wasn't that for Disney?
So that was when he was a Disney animator, before he'd made any feature films. And it was just a short little experimental film.
So you're saying he might as well have been a security guard or parking cars?
I mean, he had a real job, and they did lure him into Disney Studios that sort of helped train him. But once he started making features, he went to Warner Brothers.
Fair.
And they were doing everything in their power to keep him at Warner Brothers.
Except that Warner Brothers was the meatloaf of film studios.
You look at most of his filmography post-Ed
I'm sorry, you lost me there. Post-Deadwood?
Oh, Ed Wood.
Ed Wood. I'm sorry. Only hearing what I wanted to hear.
The Tim Burton Deadwood would be nuts.
If you like the horror genre as much as we do, you can preview the horror comic book Requiem for a Psychopath right now for free at the Inner Demon Entertainment website. Imagine a world in which horror film slashers are real. Then imagine a troubled teen bringing one out of retirement to help him take revenge on his bullies. It was written by me and drawn by friend of the show, Stephen Yu. Again, that's Requiem for a Psychopath on the Inner Demon Entertainment website. And if you dig it, please either review and rate it 5 stars on Amazon, or don't rate and review it at all. Ratings of less than 5 stars send the algorithm into murder mode for some reason. Thanks. I hope you enjoy it.
This is how strongly audiences and studios and television networks felt about doing new material in black and white. And here we are, Friday the 13th, deciding to make that bold move. Now, 10 years later, The X-Files does an episode in black and white. And even more specifically, this Friday the 13th episode is a callback to Universal black and white monster movies. 10 years later, The X-Files does a famous episode called The Postmodern Prometheus. And of course, that's a callback to Frankenstein, where the full title of Frankenstein is Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus. And it's a complete callback to, again, Universal black and white horror films. Again, it was hailed as a bold decision, as a risky decision, to have a popular TV show do a black and white episode. But it came to this huge acclaim. They were highly praised for doing something so bold, so different, so unexpected, so against the norm. And it's 10 years after Friday the 13th did it.
Dirty pool, mister. Dirty pool.
In no means, by the way, folks, am I saying that Friday the 13th is a better show than X-Files. Even when we keep talking about how it's influential. Influence doesn't necessarily mean better, but it's an interesting note. X-Files is an amazing show.
Well, I'll use this as an opportunity to jump in and say that at your request, I watched Season 5, Episode 5 of The X-Files, Postmodern Prometheus, and I have to say, I think I've enjoyed every episode of Friday the 13th, the series that I've seen thus far, more so than that episode.
Oh, well, there you go, folks.
Hot take, I know.
Yeah, I haven't seen it in a while, but it's a different episode. It leaned in more for comedy. It was very much trying to be this odd episode that was sort of outside of the main continuity.
Yes, it leaned hard and then fell on its face.
Yeah, it's a weird episode.
There's references to classic monster films. There's references to EC Comics. There's references to Cher generally, and more specifically, the film Mask.
Also Elephant Man.
There is so much going on in that episode. It gives this episode of Friday the 13th, the series, a run for its money in terms of the clasp, the cape, vampires existing, time travel. It was just too much for one novelty episode.
Yeah, it really was a lot. But that episode, very highly regarded, praised for the boldness of being different and being in black and white. And it's one of maybe only a dozen episodes that was actually directed by Chris Carter.
I can actually chime in there because I researched it for this discussion. Yes, directed by Chris Carter, written by Chris Carter, Tim Minear, and then Billy Brown.
It's interesting to see how the praise gets divvied around and the credit gets divvied around as these things are coming out.
History is written by the victors and all that.
Right.
Was Season 5, Episode 5, Postmodern Prometheus, the first high-concept episode that the show did? Because I was under the impression, yes, probably more in later years, that the show eventually did a number of high-concept episodes.
I'm pretty sure they had quite a few by Season 5.
And I'll qualify what I said earlier. I said high concept, but I'm including in high concept simply comedy episodes.
There would have been, because there were parts of the Lone Gunman episodes. Some were serious and some leaned in very heavy towards comedy. And if you guys aren't X-Files fans, Lone Gunmen were occasional characters that would show up in the X-Files that later got their own very short-lived spin-off of a show called Lone Gunmen, which Vince Gilligan from Breaking Bad is the one who ran that and also worked on the X-Files for years.
I'm pretty sure there was a Rashomon-esque episode.
Yep.
But there was no fourth wall breaking and no musical numbers, right?
Not fourth wall breaking in the way that, say, Moonlighting did it, that I can recall. Musical episode? No, I think that was more Buffy.
I assume there was a black and white episode of Buffy.
I've actually seen only a very small amount of Buffy, to tell you the truth. Part of it is because I know that they did do a Blu-ray set that was highly controversial. They reformatted the framing for widescreen TVs. They did such a sloppy job that you can see boom mics and cameramen and production gear on the edge of the frame.
Well, we just lost all our Joss Whedon fans.
Yeah, well, he's lost a lot of fans on his own over the years, so.
Frankly, it's a market we can do without.
Right.
Are there any other shows or movies that you think this episode had a direct influence on with this bold decision?
Well, I think the X-Files black and white episode definitely opened the floodgates.
X-Files stripped the ball from Friday the 13th, the series, and then ran it in for a touchdown.
Yeah, 100%. And after that, you start to see a lot more examples. You still see it. Your Breaking Bads, your WandaVisions.
Is it your supposition that this episode was shot in black and white?
It's hard to say. There is a process that they used to do called kinescope, which I don't know if that would have still been active in the 80s or not, but it was very active for sure in the 60s and 70s. Actually, Dark Shadows is a good example and an appropriate example for this audience that's into Friday the 13th series. A show that started in black and white, and after like a year, even the show, if it's so appropriate for black and white, the networks are like, hey, black and white's dead, folks. It's not hip. We need to go to color. The kinescope was a method of filming TV shows to film, and sometimes it would be done where they would film it on black and white film. And long story short, without getting too technical, and I don't even know all the technical details, sometimes just with different markets, possibly overseas markets, possibly even in small regions in the US, it'd be easier to send a black and white signal to a market that only has black and white capability. A lot of other parts of the world did not have color TV when the United States got color TV. So on Dark Shadows, some of the color versions have been destroyed, or the quality is deteriorated so much to where the only surviving copies of those episodes are the black and white copies that were copied onto film. And there's other examples of that throughout TV. Sometimes it's hard to tell if it was originally shot on black and white stock or if they transferred it to black and white stock. I would say probably somebody would have said, for safety concerns, of what if this just gets rejected by the network? Let's film it in color.
Interesting point.
And by network actually means by the broadcasters.
So we'll go all the way to the Prime Minister of Canada.
Right. So that would be my guess just from that practical standpoint, but I have no idea. The difference from colored black and white through that process doesn't stand out that much. The difference from going from video to film, huge.
Now that you've mentioned Dark Shadows, we can bring it full circle back to Disney and Tim Burton.
Yeah.
Time really is a flat circle around here.
I definitely liked Dark Shadows quite a bit as a kid, but there are some diehard Dark Shadows fans out there that hate that movie.
I guess I'm in the third category of hating the movie, having never seen the original.
Knowing nothing about Dark Shadows. Right. But yeah, as you can imagine, if you're someone who goes to Dark Shadows conventions, like Trekkies used to go to Star Trek conventions, how that movie might be felt about in that audience.
I hated that movie, and I take off a couple of extra points because it's the only movie I think I've ever been late to.
Oh.
It was on the Warner Brothers lot. It was a special screening. I look at my watch, and I'm like, I'm going to go to the restroom now because I have 10 minutes. Walk up the aisle, use it, check my watch. Perfect. 3 minutes to go. Walking back. Oh, that's weird. They closed the doors. Wait, do I hear sound? They already started the trailers? Throw open the door. Nope. Movie. Just already going. Apparently the bigwigs showed up, so they just fired it up 3 minutes early. There were no trailers. And that first part where I'm trying to find my way back to my seat in the dark was where they delivered all the exposition that brought you up on the lore of the show if you hadn't seen it. So I really needed to know that.
Yeah. No, some bigwig came in and was like, all right, now we're not waiting. Get the show rolling.
I didn't know. How could I have known? To quote Bert Gummer. So a moment ago, you asked me to, on the fly, re-edit a scene involving time manipulation. So I'll go ahead and throw that energy ball back at you here, Jeremiah. Would you have started this episode in black and white?
Well, I think given the culture, 100% not.
So you didn't lose them out of the gate?
I also wouldn't do it right before a commercial break, which I think is sort of what they did here pretty well. You've given them a good chunk for color, and then you're hoping they're going to stick with you.
And you give them a very exciting, fast-paced open.
Right.
What about artistically?
I think the reverse Wizard of Oz makes sense. There wouldn't really been a motivation for having present day stuff in black and white.
So you wouldn't have begun like the postmodern Prometheus of the X-Files with, say, something that looked like a 19th century book being opened slowly, and then we push in and begin the story in black and white, but in modern day.
I think if you were breaking the form in some other ways beyond the black and white, like if you were introducing a narrator, then maybe. But that's just a different choice, and I don't know if that's a better choice or a worse choice. It's maybe a bit more of a confusing choice to break the format in multiple ways all in one episode.
You've spoken about what a bold choice this was to do it in black and white and the impact on the society that might have been watching it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm not mistaken, you did watch it at the time as a child. Was your mind blown?
My mind wasn't blown because, again, though, I was somebody who would prefer to see the black and white version of the movie. I did not want to watch Ted Turner's colorized It's a Wonderful Life. I wanted to watch the original.
You were writing angry letters to Turner even back then?
Yeah, I would have definitely had complaints. I mean, I did think I expressed complaints about it, honestly, like just in my social circles. I mean, back then there were so many things where we had pan and scan movies. We had movies that were colorized that were originally black and white. And I was a little bit snobbish about that stuff, even at a young age. I never watched Needful Things on TV. Let me put it that way. So
Never watched the director's cut? Oh, yeah, no, that's only for us weirdos.
Yeah.
Whereas you were the one kid that was cool with widescreen editions and wasn't asking, what are those bars on the top and bottom of the screen?
Yeah, a lot of that culture changed as we get farther into the 90s and towards the end of the 90s and 2000s when DVDs become popular. Then we start getting widescreen TVs. Suddenly, black and white films start to become more acceptable to a broader audience. These cultural things, they sort of go in cycles.
Have you seen both the black and white and colorized versions of Werewolf by Night?
I would, because that's done obviously with intentionality. It's not like It's a Wonderful Life where they went back generations later and decided to color it at the Ted Turner Company.
Ted Turner kept his greedy little paws off that one, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
Have you seen both versions of The Mist?
Haven't gotten around to it, but I've heard the black and white version of it really does change your perspective on the movie quite a bit. And I could kind of see that enough to where I'm really curious.
I think I already know the answer to this, but have you ever seen the black and white version of Johnny Mnemonic?
No, and I don't know that I've ever seen the color version of Johnny Mnemonic in its entirety. So,
Touche, sir.
So.
The point is yours.
Definitely remember the movie. I remember it existing.
You are a master of no but. You need to work on your yes and, but when it comes to no but, no one kills it like Jeremiah.
But yeah, the 1990, I'm guessing 97 classic that is Johnny Mnemonic has not.
Subtitled The Film That Made Me Almost Not Go See The Matrix.
I was literally about to say that. Yes, I saw Matrix opening night at the Chinese theater here in Los Angeles.
Grauman's Chinese Theater.
Went in with such low expectations because from the masterful in the sense that it did not ruin the movie marketing, it made it to me look like just an Air Johnny Mnemonic, which just, even though I hadn't seen, I wasn't that interested in.
My exact thought was, no, Keanu. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Yeah.
And in fact, it was only because of the guys you went with that night coming back to the fraternity house and raving about it and pronouncing that they were going to run out and see it again, possibly the very next night. I was like, all right, I guess if a bunch of people are going, I'll tag along.
Yeah. Talk about a perfect lowering of expectations.
Way to level set, Keanu.
Thank you, Johnny Mnemonic, for existing, if for nothing else, to make The Matrix that much more awesome.
Some shows have a monster of the week. This series has a curio of the week, and so do we. Believe me, no one paid us for the following endorsements. And once they hear the show, it's more likely they'll pay us to retract them. We just want to share some cool things with you while simultaneously using our platform to give a little free promotion to those without a massive advertising budget. So Jeremiah, what is your curio of the week?
My curio of the week is a couple classic black and white movie recommendations. Both of them are classics, so they're not completely obscure, but they're less remembered classics than something like Citizen Kane or Casablanca or even Dracula, Frankenstein, The Wolfman. So the first film is Arsenic and Old Lace, which is a Frank Capra film. It's from 1944. It's based on a stage play from, I believe, 1940 or 41, if I'm not mistaken. Stars Cary Grant. It's a screwball comedy. Part of the reason for bringing it up in this podcast is it's a bit of a parody of horror or spooky type of stuff. It's sort of a spiritual successor to The Addams Family. There's murder and characters who suffer from insanity. Cary Grant plays the straight man, the one who's not quite fitting in with his family, but still a part of it. It's a spooky tale. It takes place on, I think, either Halloween night or maybe October 30th, something like that. If you like a comedy that references horror, this is it. There's a character played by Raymond Massey who is painted up to look like Boris Karloff from Frankenstein, and there's a lot of in-jokes about his character looking like Boris Karloff. Peter Lorre plays a role in it. Frank Capra is one of my favorite directors, easily in my top 10, and I would easily put this probably in my top 3 of his favorite films. If you like classic films from the 40s, I highly recommend it.
You mentioned it's a screwball comedy. Please tell me Cary Grant isn't attracted to his cousin?
No, he's a longtime confirmed bachelor, sort of famous for being a bachelor.
You don't say.
But he's decided to get married, and right before he's about to get married, he puts together how his kooky family is possibly a bit murderous and insane, and is worried that the insanity might run in his gene pool, and he's running around trying to cover their tracks so that maybe he can get them institutionalized, and there's a corpse hidden in the house as cops are coming in and having awkward conversations. There's almost a Weekend at Bernie's scene mixed in here or there with some of these bodies that these ants have brought to early termination.
Weekend at Bernie's, Jeremiah, stop drilling, you've struck oil.
What can possibly surpass Weekend at Bernie's? Well, outside of Weekend at Bernie's too, I guess. So the other one is The Old Dark House. This is a horror film directly, not a screwball comedy. But it's directed by James Whale, who's obviously most known for Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, all those classic Universal pictures.
Mostly known for being on your top 10 horror directors of all time list.
The Old Dark House is from 1932. It was actually remade decades later in the 60s by William Castle and Hammer Horror, which was doing a lot of remakes of classic Universal monster movies at the time.
I think that's how I know it.
This is obviously a black and white issue from the issue. This is obviously a black and white.
Nope, no dice. We're using that.
Stays in. It's definitely...
Was this before or after Crisis, Jeremiah?
It's a pre-crisis movie.
Okay.
But it's a movie from the 1930s. It's a pre-code era release, which means it had a bit more scandalous implications than a lot of movies that came a little bit later on in the later 30s and 40s and 50s. Based on a novel that had come out just a couple years prior. Features Boris Karloff, and I forget the actor's name, but the actor that played Dr. Pretorius in Bride of Frankenstein is in it. It's a very small cast because it's a haunted house movie. People are stranded due to bad weather and have to pull over and go into this creepy old house, and those are your main characters. So it's a very small cast, but almost half of them went on to win Oscars or be nominated for Oscars. Charles Laughton's in it, who went on to be an Oscar winner. He was in Witness for the Prosecution, Mutiny on the Bounty. Also directed Night of the Hunter, which was, I believe, his only directorial film. Mervyn Douglas, Oscar winner, was in HUD and Being There. Also in The Changeling with George C. Scott. Gloria Stewart is in it, who was, for modern audiences, probably best known as being nominated for an Oscar for her old lady role in James Cameron's Titanic. So obviously a long career there, multiple decades. And then also, as a crossover from Arsenic and Old Lace, Raymond Massey, who was also a nominated actor for playing Abe Lincoln.
It's the antecedent and archetype of the haunted house genre, right?
Yeah, it really is. Even something a little bit more wacky like Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Or Dan Aykroyd's Nothing But Trouble.
Absolutely. So really a classic film, not one as talked about as obviously your Universal Monsters because there's no real IP attached to it. There is no title monster character of a Dracula or Frankenstein that's a part of it. But a great Boris Karloff picture, a great James Whale picture, and definitely worthy of audiences discovering it.
Well, once again, sir, sold in the room. I will check those out.
I highly recommend.
Once again, out of deference to Jeremiah, I'm going to tailor my curio of the week to match his. So I'm giving a full-throated endorsement to the modern yet black and white film The Whisperer in Darkness. They say H.P. Lovecraft's literature is unfilmable, and they are wrong, because the H.P. Lovecraft Society absolutely nailed it back in 2011, while simultaneously creating a pitch-perfect homage to classic Universal horror films. The plot couldn't be simpler. A rural Vermont community is being terrorized by mysterious creatures, so a university folklorist is enlisted to investigate, and discovers a reality-shattering secret that threatens to doom humanity forever. Alternately humorous and chilling, The Whisperer in Darkness pays respect to Golden Age horror films, while simultaneously elevating them for a new era. I hesitate to say more for fear of spoiling a single moment, but as a modicum of proof, I'll confess that a scene of a frail old man whispering into the ear of the protagonist manages to be one of the most tense and dread-inducing moments in cinematic history, displaying a mastery of the craft that even many of the greats would be hard-pressed to match. How they created such a masterwork, a true capolavoro at all, is impressive, but how they pulled it off with the minuscule budget they had rather appropriately smashes my fragile grip on reality. It's like Ed Wood meets Mars Attacks, or simply Werewolf by Night. But even if you hate those films, watch this one anyway. Then find the trailers, especially the teaser, and watch those too. That is, unless you fear you'll succumb to the dark secret they hold. Our heroes arrive in late 19th century London, and I'm going to ask you, Jeremiah, can you tell what happens in this first moment back in London as to why Ryan can't catch up with Jagger when he just runs off into the night?
Does he try? I don't really remember him hardly trying.
Well, he's Ryan the Lion. Of course, he doesn't really hardly try.
I think between the disorientation, the concern for Mickey, Jagger vampire, gets quite a head start.
Well, I'm just surprised Jagger takes off so quickly.
That's more of the thing, actually, that Jagger thinks to start running without questioning his environment at all.
Like, now, my chance to escape in this new time period I find myself in.
Where I don't know how I got here, but I'm just going to run.
Jagger is one cool customer. The amount of insanity this man has experienced in the last 5 minutes of his life. But nothing slows him down. The guy doesn't miss a beat.
Literally, the only thing that we've seen faze him is a woman coming on to him.
Yes, not being turned into a vampire or traveling through time.
Yeah, but, this landlady's making a move. But being bitten, attacked, cursed, transported through time, nope, he's on it.
That's why I brought up 80s gay. It's the only thing that ruffles his feathers.
You never know. Well, I do think it's framed out to make it so that he can't escape easily.
They don't want to deal with it, so just have part of the screen obscured, and then we can just headcanon whatever happened off screen.
Exactly. I have a question for you.
Shoot.
The paper boy, who's a full-grown man, but we'll call him the paper boy. Could you tell what he says when he's shouting out his headline?
The ship that sunk? I don't know.
I'm pretty sure, though, he says something about the Queen of Scots. When people say Queen of Scots, they usually mean Mary, who was around in the 1500s. But even if you want to look at, ever queens, by 1706, Scotland and England joined together to become Great Britain. So there, at that point, is no more kings or queens of Scots. It's all just the king or queen of Great Britain.
Wow, you know your history here.
I was in a lot of academic and history bowls as a kid and stuff like that. So
you're a man of letters.
Yeah, things like this would come up. So the English and Scottish royal family, shortly after Mary, Queen of Scots, those two royal houses joined, and her son eventually becomes both the king of England and Scotland together. And from that point, every royal was both. So starting from around 1600, every royal after that was both simultaneously the king or queen of England and the king or queen of Scotland at the same time.
Tradition.
So either way, though, even if you're not talking about Queen Mary, any point after 1600-something, on a London paper, you would no longer call the royal the Queen of Scots, because that queen is also the Queen of England.
Jeremiah, I can't tell you how much I hope the hate mail that we get over your lecture on Scottish and English history comes from the exact same guy who's also going to write about your Chautauqua on film stock history.
Right.
I feel like there's a lot of Venn diagram overlap there.
Well, send those letters to Robert at Inner Demon Man. The ever minor thing, and it's very minor, but March 12th, 1875 is the date on that newspaper. A little early for Abraham to be in London at that point. At that point, he would have still been in Ireland, not been quite married just yet. You would think the show is in 1987, maybe 1988 is when it airs. Maybe you would just say, oh, let's go back 100 years and pick 87 or 88. Or let's actually look up the history books and see exactly when Bram Stoker moved to London or when he got married. But no, for some reason they picked 1875, and it seems a little bit arbitrary because it doesn't line up with any part of Bram Stoker's life or the history of the Dracula novel or anything specific that needs to be in this show.
Well, while we're going to stop to pedantically nitpick, I would also point out that when Ryan says March 12th, 1875, most of Europe puts the day before the month.
Well, and actually, let's nitpick even a little bit more, I guess. And I really need to double check this because obviously this is really obscure history. I think the London Herald, or the various versions of the London Herald, wasn't being published at that time. The main Herald that's published in England to this day, I think, came around a little bit before World War One.
Man, your school had one hell of a history bowl team.
Well,
You also know the entire biography of Bram Stoker?
I don't know about the entire biography, but
But which years he made the transition from Ireland to England?
because it overlaps with other historical figures too.
And his wife's real name?
It's not just because of him, it's because his life intersects with a lot of ever important people. Oscar Wilde, we're about to talk about here shortly, once we talk about his wife.
Didn't know you were an expert on Oscar Wilde either. You were almost a physics major, not a history major.
True, but yeah, I used to participate in like the history bowls and
I don't know, a history bowls is starting to feel like the light reflecting off swamp gas excuse of your backstory. I don't know what you're really up to, Jeremiah, but I don't think it's history bowls.
anyway, there's just a bunch of things about this date specifically that doesn't line up.
All right, sir. Well, lead the way. What's next? Do you want to talk about when 19th century English newsies started wearing fingerless gloves? I know you're also a master of all things sartorial.
That I don't know. So to be fair to the show, there's always stuff that just isn't going to be accurate. And a show like this doesn't need to be.
No, you're the one nitpicking this, not me.
Well, sure.
I didn't care about any of this.
Sure.
I was actually giving this one credit for its production value.
I am too. The Queen of Scots thing or whatever they were saying about Scotland just threw me.
Of the two of us, I'm the one that lived there, and I'm like, yeah, this seems about right. Granted, I didn't do it in the 19th century, but still, very little's changed.
Well, but we do know this is supposed to be the Victorian era,
Fair.
which by definition is the Queen Victoria era.
Yes.
That's instantly something that should be sort of obvious, that if you're talking about any king or queen and it's not Queen Victoria in these headlines, something's off.
True. It is an eponymous era.
You'd think that they would make up a headline about Queen Victoria just by default.
You gonna finish that thought with God Save the Queen? Turns out you're quite the Anglophile, Jeremiah. Who knew?
I guess just to continue the technical, historically inaccurate flow of this, we might as well transition to this couple that approach our two heroes. Do you want to set that up?
Not really.
Okay. So,
I don't know what else I can add. Fake Bram
they're-
Stoker and his even more fake wife walk up.
yeah, so it's, spoiler alert, these characters introduce themselves as Abraham and Caitlin. Abraham is Bram Stoker. His wife, her actual name is Florence, not Caitlin.
Yes, Florence Balcombe. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, but it's Balcombe, although I presume she took her husband's last name, as was the style of the time.
Yep. Much later on. I don't know. Should we save that? Let's save that. That might come in more at the end.
Oh, we're saving something now. Well, folks, this must be important. Stick with us in part 8 when we get to whatever we're setting up now. I'm not even clear on it.
Yeah, I'm thinking we'll save the discussion on the famous Nosferatu lawsuit.
Ah, I see.
Bram Stoker and his wife, we'll call her Caitlin, approach our two cousins.
Oh, God, I hope that's not important to what you're going to say next.
So,
Please continue. Why is it important that they're cousins, Jeremiah?
oh yeah, no, it's going to come up. We're going to explore some interesting things. But they come up very, for no real motivation. Mickey and Ryan look a little disoriented. Mickey's bleeding from the face. That's obviously problematic. But they approach him in a very fun, lighthearted, I don't know, just a way that even like...
A way that a struggling writer and his wife in Victorian England might not be.
Right. He announces that he's something of a writer, which he literally says, well, not literally, but figuratively says 100 times after this.
Well, he's a writer, Jeremiah. I mean, that checks out.
Right. But he doesn't need to announce it for every moment. Anything that comes up relates to the fact that, like, well, I'm the writer here. And
No, writers notoriously social and outgoing. Gregarious, if you will.
I do actually want to give a little historical credit. He implies that they're here for the Playhouse, which does make sense for Bram Stoker, because the reason Bram Stoker moved to London
Was for the vibrant theater scene.
what he spent most of his life doing, more so than writing. He was the manager of the Lyceum Theater and mentor under Henry Irving, who was a very famous stage actor. He's the first actor to ever be knighted, so he's actually Sir Henry Irving.
Bravo.
So it seemed like a nice little reference to that, which was cool. Henry Irving brought Bram over from Ireland. In a lot of ways, he's credited as, from a personality standpoint or from a presence standpoint, what Dracula, the character and mannerisms of Dracula, was modeled off of.
Interesting.
Bram was very obsessed with Henry Irving, which we'll also touch on here in a moment, some of the implications of that.
All right, new recurring segment, 19th century gay?
Yeah, so I guess let's cut to that, maybe.
Wow, what a cliffhanger. Just as your favorite Friday the 13th, the series podcast was about to deep dive into the torrid history and sexual proclivities of both Bram Stoker and Sir Henry Irving. But be honest, it was a move so brazen you kind of suspected it from the start. Well, we'll pick up right there next episode, and don't think for 1 second we'll forget to include Florence Balcom in the mix. Tune in next time for all that, probably a host of other esoteric topics, and who knows, possibly even a soupçon of discussion about Friday the 13th, the series. Thanks for listening, everyone. We know you have a lot of choices when choosing a Friday the 13th, the series podcast, and we sincerely thank you for choosing ours. Special thanks to Joshua Romeo for original music and to Stephen Yu for original art. And be sure to check out the Joe on Joe podcast, the only podcast where Joe Schlepsky discusses G.I. Joe. If you want to support our show, you can leave a review and rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. If you want an occasional update on our projects, you can sign up for our newsletter at the Inner Demon Entertainment website. And if you want to complain about social media with us on social media, you can find links on our website. And always remember what Carl said to Frylock. It don't matter. None of this matters. Good night, everybody.